All right, so my research project is looking at how digital and analog compressors affect your mix differently. With so many different options of compressors and the endless battle between analog and digital, I hope to shed some light on different mixing practices. I will start by presenting my research objectives, followed by a brief literature review, and then I'll walk through my methods and test results, and then give you kind of what it all means. So first, I wanted to know to what extent digital emulations and the analog hardware are able to provide mixing engineers the means to copy their artistic intentions. When I began, I thought that there would be very little difference between analog and digital and that the original mix would be preferred over the conversion, because there was still enough of a difference between analog and digital, but both were useful in their own ways. And since I assumed they wouldn't be perfect copies of each other, my next question aims to determine if there was a preference for analog or digital compressors. And I did not expect that there would be a clear preference either way. So start off with a quick definition here. According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, there are four different definitions of compression, none of which relate to audio. Though the best one to me is number 4 here, conversion in order to reduce the space occupied. Well, if we think of this in terms of dynamic range compression, we can tweak this definition a little to fit audio rather than physical space, such as reducing the height of an object. And then if we specifically relate this to audio, it could be reducing the amplitude of a waveform. Obviously, this is oversimplified, but we can use it as a springboard to get to my favorite definition of compression, a creative tool to control the loudness of an audio waveform, creating space and ultimately allowing musicians to stand out more in a mix. A compressor is the tool that allows mixing engineers to use compression as a creative tool. Nowadays, it comes as either a physical piece of hardware or a downloadable piece of software. As previously stated, compressors serve to reduce the dynamic range, and because of the complex circuitry involved in old analog gear, they were seen as a complex signal processing unit. The complex circuitry also added distortion, or in other words, character. Here's some examples of my favorite compressors, hardware with these two, a digital and an emulation. And due to the compressor's complex design and primitive nature of electronics, harmonic distortion was added into the compressor's output signal. A study in distortion in dynamic compressors found the faster attack times and higher ratios can push the compressor to work harder and increase the level of distortion. This example here shows faster attack time, increasing the level of distortion within the same time window. Likewise, you could also kind of imagine this as a higher ratio and the compressor working harder, and thus adding more distortion. With the rise of digital plugins, programmers began to add in harmonic distortion manually. But since the hardware no longer limited the character of the harmonic distortion, anything became possible, whether you wanted to emulate a piece of analog gear or create a compressor with a unique character. For my study, I focused on one specific compressor, the versatile Empirical Labs distressor. Straight out of the 90s, the distressor quickly became a studio staple. With its 8 ratio options, each ratio was essentially a different compressor due to its character. It was one of the most versatile compressors available, and with enough playing could color any type of signal from a growly bass to a mellow acoustic guitar. It also had the options for additional harmonic distortion with its distortion 2 and distortion 3 features that added either even or odd harmonics to the output signal. For its digital counterpart, I chose Slate Digital's FG Stress, a licensed emulation of the distressor. It models every feature of the analog hardware and also includes a mix knob that was not used for this study, but I think would be interesting to implement in a future version of this study. So I recorded 2 bands to get the stimuli for my research. The first was a local pop punk group, Reckless Renegade, where the drums were recorded in Studio One with the guitars, bass, vocals recorded in a home studio and using digital amps for the guitars and bass. The second is a local punk group, Garbage in the Gits, where all instruments were recorded in Studio One. Both tracks were then mixed in Studio 2 at the University of Lethbridge, with Reckless Renegade being mixed using the analog distressors and then converted digital to the digital plugins at the end of the mix process. Garbage in the Gits was mixed with digital compressors and the settings were then converted to the analog units after the mix process. I should also say that all other mixing tools were kept the same, so exact same EQs and any other effects that were added to the track, and the compressors were inserted at the same point in the signal chain, so there's no issues there. Finally, for my test, I created multiple Pro Tools files that counterbalanced the analog and digital versions in a double-blind perceptual experiment with ambiguously titled A and B tracks. For each participant of my study, track A was the analog mix for 4 of the 8 samples, and the digital for the other 4, further reducing any biases from the experiment. And lastly, all files were normalized to -1 dBFS to eliminate the bias of loudness. This is an example. This is an example of a session that would be presented to a participant. 8 samples between 5 and 10 seconds in length. The responses were recorded on paper, and then using this decoder, they were then interpreted. So here's a brief example of what you would see if you were a participant in this study. I would normally ask for a show of hands for who can hear a difference, but obviously we can't do that right now. So if anyone wants to say any comments about what they hear in terms of difference, then that can lead to a little discussion afterwards. So this is the first sample here.
How does she keep wandering in my mind? How does she keep wandering in my mind?
And now you'll get A,
Sorry.
B, and back to A. Yes?
Sorry to jump in. We can use the chat if you want. We can use the
yes.
chat. Everybody
that'd be
can
great.
say they prefer A or B.
Yeah, so this one will be A, B, and then back to A, so you can really hear the difference.
How does she keep wandering in my mind?
All right, so this was the first sample of, the sample was the analog to digital track from Reckless Renegade. Track A in this case being the digital, and track B being the analog. I can't actually see the chat, so did anyone have any comments in there? No?
I like A.
A, the digital.
Yeah.
What difference did you maybe hear?
It was a little bit brighter.
Brighter? Yeah, that was a very common answer, which we'll definitely get to. So I got another one here as well, the other full mix of that was in this session. So this would be the 5th one that a participant would run into. It's from Garbage in the Gits, the digital to analog track. So again, here it'll be A, B, and then ABA. All right, so again, track A was the with the digital compressors, and track B was the converted analog version. So any comments here on this one?
I can read them to you if you want.
Yeah, sure.
So Ryland likes B, Leo likes A, Kelsey likes B, Matt Herman likes A, Max McKinnon likes A, Feifei likes A. I think Ken likes A, I prefer B, and Courtney likes A. Yeah, and Spencer likes A, and yeah, whatever. So it's a lot of A.
Okay, yeah, still kind of divided though, but yeah, definitely a preference towards analog. All right, so we'll use that to get into the test results then. So with 8 trained listeners and 8 samples per test, a total of 64 trials were conducted. The survey presented them with the same 3 questions for all 8 sample pairs. First, simply asking if they could hear a difference between tracks A and B. Next, they were asked to describe what differences they heard. And finally, to determine if they had a preference or if the samples were just so incredibly close that they didn't have one. So the results that came from this study are presented now. This is the first question. Of all 64 trials, a difference was perceived just shy of 80% of the time, with a standard deviation of 17.6%, and those results were highly significant. An interesting note for this one is that the only sample pair here that had a difference rate less than 50% was the drum overheads from the digital to analog track. Here are the summary of listener preferences from question 3 is presented, with analog outweighing digital 27 to 17, with 20 trials labeled as no preference. At this point, I should note that for a response of no difference, if they answered they couldn't hear a difference in the first one, it was assumed they would not have a preference. These results also came back highly significant. And it should also be noted that whether the track was originally mixed with analog compressors or digital made no difference for the results, which threw my hypothesis out the window from earlier in this presentation. Where the interesting results came into play, however, is the preferences by sample. Taking a look at the bass guitar and the kick sample, they had identical preference ratios. They are also both low frequency instruments, so I find this interesting. So the bass being here with 4 analog, 1 digital, 3 no preference. The kick follows the same pattern. Further to that point, the full mixes that you guys heard also received identical preference ratios, 2 analog, 4 digital, and 2 no preference for the first one, and then the same thing, 2, 4, and 2 for the other full mix. On the flip side, I had 2 drum bus samples from the tracks that had quite different preference ratios. So the first one here, 3 analog to 4 digital and 1 no preference, and then the other one 6 to 2 in favor of the analog. I'm speculating this is due to the amount of cymbals that were used in this sample that I chose. So really just highlighted, I guess, maybe the high frequencies or the presence of the cymbals, and really divided the group. So before I get into my qualitative data, here's a little background info about how I organized it. 5 different categories of concepts from the responses: compression, low frequencies, high frequencies, balance, and tone. When I processed it, I organized it by analog and digital comments and aggregated the responses from question 2 about differences and question 3 about preferences in order to further highlight the similarities in the comments. Some assumptions that I made to better organize my data were to transform comments into positives wherever possible. So for example, if someone said the analog track is missing the low end, I would classify that as the digital track having more sub in the low frequency category. And for ambiguous responses, such as just difference in dynamics without specifying, I would say that they preferred or if they preferred the digital track, I would say that the digital had more dynamics in this case. So for the compression category, analog received the most positive comments, like more dynamics and better attack and release. However, digital prevailed in adding punch and increasing perceived loudness. The digital track also tended to be identified as having overcompressed the sample. In this case, I classified it as the analog not overcompressing the sample in order to keep it as a positive in favor of the analog. High frequency content seems to be where the digital really shines, pun intended. The digital version was identified as adding more high frequency content or increasing brightness. And the analog version was also said to have tamed high frequencies, or in other words, attenuated highs, which was sometimes positive, sometimes negative. But in either case, it seemed to be doing a good job of attenuating high frequencies.
Sorry, Carter, I have to stop you. Time is off.
Okay, yeah, let me just get my conclusion up here. So that's a little example I had. But
sorry.
That's okay. So yeah, basically,
Okay.
This is just the summary here. So
Awesome.
Do you have any questions?
Questions, guys? Andy, do you have any comment or question?
I had a question. It's Leo.
Okay, go ahead.
It says in your conclusion that the analog adds energy, maintains dynamics, and improves rhythm. I'm just wondering if you could speak about the improves rhythm. I just don't understand how a compressor would be able to, like, what the correlation between rhythm and the compression would be.
I guess maybe improves is the wrong choice of words there, but rather highlights the rhythm more. So if you think of it in terms of the adding energy and the maintaining of the dynamics, the compressor seemed to do a better job at increasing the sense of rhythm that the participants received. So not necessarily making it more on time, but just maybe making the rhythm a little bit easier to follow. So I guess improving sense of rhythm would be a better phrasing for that.
Do you think it has something to do with, like, just the attack envelope being, like, more defined or whatever in the?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I definitely think that's what it has to do with. Yeah, just the fact that it's maybe a little bit of a better at improving some of the punch.
Interesting. Super.
Yeah. Thank you. Great question.
Okay. And you got some good comments on the chat also. You can look at that when you're done.
Okay.
Maybe
Sounds
one
good.
more question. There's another question or a comment. Just feel free to jump in.
So I guess I just before someone says a question, I just want to say that there really wasn't a clear, like, analog is better or digital is better, that both maybe have their own purpose. So that's kind of what this conclusion is saying here, that digital is good for these three things and analog is better for, these three things in general, obviously.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. But what is interesting is, like, it's supposed to be the same gear, right? Like,
yeah.
No, it's supposed to be, but in this case, it was very, very different compared to what Ryland found, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. Which was cool because he used the distressors as well, but he used the UAD plugins. So it's interesting to kind of see all three of them now just across two studies.
Oh, totally. And great job, Carter. It was very good.
Thank you.